Did you know that events such as the death of the youngest of the Johnson brothers or the assassination of Sweet took place in the real world? It turns out that Rockstar North, creating the entire GTA San Andreas, and at the same time also the gangs that are in the game, were inspired by the events from the real world, which isn't that surprising knowing that we can find such examples all the time. We're big fans of this type of solution because they add a lot more fun to the gameplay for players. Searching for events after completing the game's storyline, on which the developers base their own story, makes us want to investigate more, and when we manage to come across some cool discoveries and connect all the dots, we simply feel great satisfaction. We've just been able to gather some material recently, so today we'll be discussing one of the gangs on which the events of GTA San Andreas are based. Welcome to the Gaming Investigators channel, and without further ado, let's get to work. In the very beginning, we'd like to discuss one of the first ideas of the developers regarding the families. Orange Grove families, to be more specific. As you probably know, originally the creators had a slightly different concept of CJ and Sweet's gang in their heads, which we said much more about in the episode devoted to the Orange Grove families and the flats, which in turn we know from the final version of the Balas. We recommend you watch our video about these two gangs because we show a lot of leftovers from the game files and from the game itself. The video will be displayed in a tab right now. Coming back to our topic, there's just a lot of circumstantial evidence that makes it quite clear that the Hoover Crips was one of Rockstar's first inspirations for making GSF in the early development of GTA San Andreas. Before we get to the things that illustrate all this, we'd like to briefly introduce you to the background of the Hoovers first. In general, Hoovers began operating in the 1960s as Hoover's Groovers, and here it's also worth adding that the gang existed long before the creation of the Crips, about a decade before. At first, the relations between the two organizations were not very colorful. As it turns out, the basis of the entire conflict was, and here we encourage you to focus a bit more because you may associate the cause with something, the murder of the younger brother of one of the founders of the Hoovers. And while the gang had no evidence that the West Side Crips had done it, most of the accusations fell on the Crips anyway. We're sure that many of you connected this event with the death of CJ's younger brother Brian. Either way, the two organizations agreed to meet at the St. Andrews Recreation Center in Los Angeles to settle the matter once and for all. In the end, an agreement was reached and the two gangs even formed an alliance. What's more, the Figueroa Boys faction was blamed for the death, which a few weeks later ended with the leader of this gang being severely beaten in one of the nightclubs in LA. In turn, in the mid-1970s, Hoover's Groovers continued their alliance with the West Side Crips, which had already lasted for several years. Due to this, there have been some changes in the gang. Among other things, it was decided to change the name of the gang, which from now on was called the Hoover Crips. However, things quickly began to get very complicated because the Crips gang began to split up on a massive scale. More and more soldiers disagreed with the beliefs of other sets, which gradually separated them from the main branches of their gang. However, it wasn't like each gang suddenly went off on its own, as some sets were still friendly with others. Of course, there was no shortage of disputes in all this. For instance, in 1979, a conflict broke out between the Rollin' 60s Neighborhood Crips and the 8 Trey Gangster Crips. Since both factions were among the largest, they wanted to gather as many allies as possible from the remaining sets. Gangs that wanted to join the Rollin' 60s Neighborhood Crips usually added the phrase Neighborhood Crips to their name, while those that preferred to stick with the 8 Trey Gangster Crips added Gangster Crips to their name. If you're wondering about the Hoover Crips, they chose to support the 8 Trey Gangster Crips. But since August 1979, the situation between the Hoover Gangster Crips and the rest of the sets was constantly very tense. This was because of the news of the drive-by shooting of Raymond Washington, one of the founders of the Crips. The news spread over Los Angeles pretty quickly, and all the Crips factions were in deep mourning as an iconic character of the gang died. We're guessing now that some of you recall a scene from the introduction movie, where the leader of the Grove Street families, Sweet, was going to die due to the drive-by as well. Going back to the real world, the situation was quite serious, and within a few days, all factions began to launch their investigations to find the culprits of this event. As it turned out, the Hoover Gangster Crips quickly found themselves on this blacklist, and the gang was under surveillance of other sets, such as the East Side Crips. It's not clear what the reasons were for the Hoovers being immediately looked at as the prime suspects, but we have some guesses. We think one of the reasons may have been that, historically, the Hoovers were previously enemies of the Crips. The gang may have had a motive of their own, such as destroying the entire gang from within and then ordering the smaller factions to rename themselves Hoovers at the right time. Later in the 1980s, there were further serious clashes between the Hoover Gangster Crips and other Crip sets. Conflicts continued to deepen, which made the Hoovers more and more eager to break the alliance with the Crips. And so in the 1990s, the Hoover Gangster Crips officially separated from the Crips, this time changing the name to Hoover Criminals, with which they have remained until today. And now at this point, it's time to move on to the next part of the episode, in which we will discuss what both the Hoover Gangster Crips and the Orange Grove families have in common. The first thing the two gangs have in common is the orange color, which somewhat became the identification mark of the Hoovers. Admittedly, the gang is also identified with the blue color due to its attachment to the Crips, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Moving on, the next similarity can be seen by looking at where the gang comes from. For example, the Hoover Gangster Crips were formed in the Hoover Street area, where our GSF homies are from Grove Street. However, the main reference that we've already mentioned a bit while discussing the history of the Hoovers gang is the Big Smoke thread. Namely, while playing the game's plot, we remember how Big Smoke, a high-ranking member of GSF, at some point becomes a drug baron in Los Santos. Well, certainly many of our American viewers have noticed that Big Smoke's character is based on Rick Freeway Ross, a man who built his powerful drug empire in Los Angeles in the 1980s. The story of Rick Ross and drugs was very well presented in the case of Big Smoke's cooperation with the local syndicate, which in turn worked for the Contra organization. Some time ago, we released quite an extensive video on this topic, so if you're interested, we recommend you watch it. The link will now be displayed to you in the tab. Anyway, in one of the interviews, Rick Freeway Ross talks about wanting to join the Hoover Crips because of the neighborhood he grew up. There's even speculation that Rick Ross unofficially belonged to this gang, but only played the role of the so-called earner. It's just that the Hoovers received a lot of money from Ross, who also supplied them and many other gangs with crack. So looking at how similar the story of Big Smoke and Rick Ross is, we think that this is yet another proof that the Hoover Gangster Crips gang was one of the inspirations of the developers in the context of creating the Greens in GTA San Andreas. Finally, we'd like to talk about a rather unusual change to the Grove Street families that Rockstar North implemented probably quite late in development. We're talking about the color that our gang represents. As all of you probably know, we have a gang in the game that's allegedly based on the Crips. However, the problem is that a large part of the sets that belong to the Crips wear blue or dark colors, not green. So why did the developers finally opt for green instead of blue? Well, presumably this decision was made to avoid more ties to this gang. If the Grove Street families wore blue colors, everything would be clear from the start. However, in all this, we have reasonable presumptions that at some stage of the game, the developers plan to keep the original colors. We believe so based on some leads from Binko's clothes shop. Namely, when we're in the store and then go to the selection with hats, we'll notice that the offer also includes bandanas. Bandanas are available in green, black, red, and, what is interesting for us, in blue. Perhaps it's a coincidence, or perhaps something that can confirm the whole theory. Unfortunately, we don't know that. But given that red is associated with the Bloods and blue with the Crips, there might be something to it. So on the one hand, we have Grove Street families, which we can't attribute to any of the Crip sets. And on the other hand, the Balas, a gang who is supposedly based on the Bloods, being an arch nemesis of the Crips, but referred to the Grape Street Crips, which wear purple colors. One big mess to say the least. To sum up the topic of today's video, it might seem that the Hoover Gangster Crips were undoubtedly a very important link in the creation of GTA San Andreas, and the Grove Street families in general. The developers devoted a lot of time to carefully look at the history of the Hoover Street Gangsters, which, among other things, translated into the creation of well-known threads, such as the death of Brian Johnson, an attempt to kill Sweet on Grove Street, or Big Smoke's vision as a drug baron. Nevertheless, it's worth noting that Rockstar North was not entirely convinced by this idea, so a few months before the game was released, it was decided to redo everything, thus avoiding the potential controversy associated with showing real Los Angeles gangs in a bad light. Be sure to watch the episode about Orange Grove families and the Flats to stay on topic and learn even more about it. Thanks for stopping by. Take care and see you soon.